This is part 13 of The Wintermaker, read to you by author Jason Lee Willis. Chapter 56, The Low Road. Haggard Quarry, March 19th, 1962. Wally Crane slowed his truck and trailered boat as he approached Haggard Quarry. He'd left the boat hitched to his truck in case of another needed rescue, but he never expected a phone call from Biff Forsberg. Wally wanted to say, "I told you so," to the others. He knew that the Blue Plymouth had indeed been a predator. Although Biff had seen Mr. Derby Hat driving towards Split Rock a few hours earlier, Wally knew Old Copper Road was now closed, which meant he'd drive around the lake to St. John. But first, I need to confront Red Dobie. Glancing to the passenger window, he could see the shore of Lake Manitou still a foot from the road. Ewan had been right about security of the quarry. Long before a drop came over the road, the entirety of the Guerin farm would be filled and flooded as Canaranzi Creek drained into the Crow Wing River. The '72 Colt sat ready at his side. Thank God I didn't act on what the kid said a few days earlier. A few days earlier, he'd tucked all three weapons, the Colt, the Barlow, and the castration knife, into his Orion Fleece trucker jacket with intentions of acting on young Biff's theory that Red Dobie was the predator. Had the storm not arrived, he would have made the trip to either the supply shed or Red's home up by Nimrod. Red is certain to be at the quarry. A car approached from St. John, and Wally, listening again to the voice of reason, took his foot off the brake. Sure, Red was as thick as thieves with the Sinclair clan and the mysterious Order of Eos, but could he be a killer? Granted, none of them were cartoon villains. They took orders and did what needed to be done. But for Red to one day crack and start murdering kids and old ladies and become a roller coaster saboteur? It's all the work of Mr. Derby Hat, and Red's going to give me a name. All these thoughts filled Wally's head as he approached, and through the temporary blindness of the headlights, he stiffened. You and Haggard? It made sense for the quarry's owner to show up in a crisis. Wally imagined what the scene would have looked like if he'd drawn the pistol on Red, only to have Haggard show up a few seconds later. The brake lights and turn signal confirmed that Ewan was going to babysit his business through the foul weather. I'm not an assassin, Wally decided, and switched his foot from the brake to the gas pedal. I'm just a delivery man in need of some gas. He stopped at the gas station in St. John. While he filled up his truck and afterwards the boat gas tank, he practiced what he'd say to Albert Fisher when he arrived in Split Rock. Mr. Derby Hat had been spotted by the boys on Old Copper Road last summer. Then he'd been spotted by the Guerin family that same day. Between the Larson and Stewart killings, Wally had seen Mr. Derby Hat driving the Plymouth toward Nimrod, where Red lived. Is Red being set up? Earlier today, Mr. Derby Hat had been driving towards Split Rock on Old Copper Road when the bus accident happened. Standing at the counter of a gas station, paying for a Hostess apple pie and his fuel, Wally had to deliberately remember which pocket held his wallet and which pockets were holding the weapons. What the hell am I doing? You're a goddamn truck driver, not a hero. He returned to his truck and hesitated. Just go home to your family. That's how you can be helpful. Finally, he pulled out and began driving back south. A pair of headlights crawled out of the quarry and for a brief moment looked out toward the lake. Then the car turned south, becoming a small red dot. A moment later, another pair of headlights crawled out of the quarry and turned towards Wally. A Bel Air. It's Red's car. It had only been a glimpse between blinks, but Wally felt certain of that detail. He stopped accelerating, but kept his foot off the brake. Ahead of him, the first vehicle picked up speed and vanished into the darkness. The road south led to Highway 10, which could lead any traveler out of Hiawatha County in a hurry. The Bel Air headed north to St. John. So much for confronting Red. At the corner, Wally slowed to a crawl in case Red was watching him through his rearview mirror. Deeming it safe, he turned into the quarry and continued on. When he came down to the bottom of the quarry, Wally gasped, seeing a sunken lake. The recent storms, both the snow and the rain, flooded the base, but he could see the tires of the machines that the standing water was only a few inches deep. Having driven it 100 times, he knew the path to the fuel station was on higher ground than the other parts of the quarry. His headlights caught Ewan Haggard's truck parked and running in front of the supply office. A second car, a 1959 Edsel, driven by Craig Healy, was parked without its lights near the pump station, which still operated. The lights in the office were on, and a body rested on the deck in front of the open door. Wally stopped his truck, reaching for the Colt on the seat beside him. He opened the door, and with his gun drawn, stepped out into the night. Remembering what Biff had told him about security, he ignored the lights of the office for a moment, grabbed his big flashlight from his dashboard, and shined it on the far western wall where the purported security team camped at a discreet location. A second body lay face down in the water about 100 yards away. Wally turned back to the shed, approaching the other body cautiously. This one had a knee up and an arm propped against a railing post. Blood dripped off the edge of the deck. A lot of blood. Wally's focus turned to the interior of the shed, but nothing moved. With a moment to focus, he confirmed the body against the rail was indeed Craig Healy, a man who should have been checking the operation pumps. Instead, half of his face was missing, and 3 bullet holes oozed blood from his chest. Stop. Drive back up to the main office and call the cops. Duty, not reason, pushed him forward. At the doorway, Wally heard a gurgling sound. It continued for several seconds before a man's groan followed. Blood streaked the hallway leading to the back of the shed, and the secret door described by the boys was left wide open to reveal the man-made tunnel leading toward the lake. Leave. Run. This is too much for you. Wally stepped into the light of the office. If that was Red leaving, he'd be to the police station by now. Help should be coming. Taking another step, he saw a phone, exposed wires showing, tossed against the far wall. The gurgling noise continued. Wally leaned down and took a side step to peer around the counter. There was a man, sitting. After a moment of hesitation, Wally moved around the counter to see Ewan Haggard struggling to breathe. He had a gunshot wound to his chest. Weary eyes locked on Wally. Ewan's head bobbed in recognition. A slight smile first, and then a grimace from his blood-stained mouth. Fucking thieves, he muttered. Fucking traitors. Wally turned his attention to the back room, taking quiet steps before deciding no one else was with them. He paused at the open secret door, stunned to see it exactly as described. What were they doing here? Wally walked boldly to Ewan, careful not to slip on the man's blood. He crouched near his lifetime acquaintance. During World War II, he'd seen plenty of dying men. Ewan was moments from death. Who shot you, Haggard? It was Dobie. Fucking traitor. Alistair Sinclair is... Ewan grimaced. 2 more bullet wounds could be seen in his belly. The wound in his chest explained the gurgling noise. At the extreme lower part of his lung, the collected blood simply sputtered out of the wound, allowing him to still breathe from the other lung without drowning on his own blood. You need to stop him, Wally. Stop who? Red. He's insane. He's trying to wake... Oh, God. The fuckers. The dam. They're gonna flood the quarry. Wally stood, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Brian's in danger, Ewan continued. Red killed the Stewart boy. Sinclair doesn't want any witnesses. They took... Brian is safe, Wally said, knowing the boy was with Nielsen in the hospital in Brainerd. It's not time, Ewan muttered. It's not time. Wally walked around Ewan, reached under his arms, and tried to drag him toward the door. Doing so brought a violent reaction from Ewan, and immediately Wally stopped, moving him back into a sitting position. Red is going to blow the dam. What? Wally leaned in closer. Death magic. He's going to kill a bunch of folks. The dam? Ewan nodded. It's not time. I don't know why. Stop him. Let me die in my quarry. Wally stepped back, blood on his hands. Soon he was running. His feet splashed loudly in the shallow water, sending ripples all the way to the corpse of Craig Healy. He set the pistol beside him, and when he turned the key, he felt blood sticking to his skin. If cops showed up right now, I'd be arrested for this. He turned his rig around, careful to be respectful of the dead security guard. His truck climbed out of the quarry, and when it reached civilization, Wally saw a flash of light in the distance. He stopped immediately, stepping out of the truck just in time to hear the rumble of thunder. But it hadn't been lightning, and the rumble wasn't the sound of thunder. His headlights illuminated the dozen cabins and houses along the shore of the river. Chapter 57, River of Souls. Leech Lake, Minnesota, March 20th, 1962. The Wintermaker split into two parts. In her dream, Lily Guerin saw a faint shadow drift away from Haggard Quarry to the south. The shadow passed by Sterling Junction, turned east at Verndale, then continued out of Hiawatha County to the airport of Brainerd. The corporeal form of the Wintermaker, however, headed north. He departed Haggard Quarry, reached St. John, and headed east toward the reservation. She knew why the Wintermaker hated her people more than any other on earth, and the community of 148 souls was fixed in his gaze. Her heart pounded, but the Wintermaker did not approach the community or school. Instead, he turned toward McGeesee. In her lucid state, she could not warn him, so she hardened her heart for whatever unfolded. Yet, instead of continuing toward her brother, the Wintermaker headed for the Nicollet Dam, built on the second lot north of Lake Manitou. Focus, Lily told her sleeping consciousness. Look past the cloud of sleep. To do so meant endangering herself. But for a better view, Lily revealed her location. It worked. The mask of the Wintermaker was pulled away to reveal a man with a red beard and a red stocking cap. He drove his car to the edge of the dam, where two vehicles were already parked. The car's headlights pointed toward the dam and the windshield wipers on high. The servant of the Wintermaker honked the horn several times before sliding into the passenger seat. A moment later, a solitary worker came out of the square blockhouse on the other side of the dam, jogging over the deck and climbing up and across the metal scaffolding above the old log chute. As the worker came down the metal steps, the Wintermaker's servant stepped out from the passenger door. "Hey, Red!" the man shouted over the roar of the water passing through the chute behind him. "What's going on?" "I wanted to make sure you boys were doing okay. My old man used to manage this dam, but he never had a storm like this one. We've been working parallel shifts to make sure we don't have any issues with debris or blockage." "You must have drawn the shortest straw, huh, Kirkpatrick?" Red asked. "Exactly," Kirkpatrick said, shaking Red's outstretched hands. "I'll show you what I'm dealing with." Kirkpatrick led him up and over the metal bridge that spanned the old log chute and onto the deck of the bridge. On the north side of the bridge, heavy metallic cables and orange buoys were stretched across the reservoir to snag trees and other debris that floated down the river. A few trees already caught on the line, as well as a tree wedged in one of the timber gates. "We've got to clear that gate tomorrow, but our 5 Tainer gates are wide open just to keep up," Kirkpatrick said as they crossed the deck. "What sort of water flow are you guys estimating?" Jake calculated nearly 40,000 cubic feet per second. "It dropped earlier this evening. Pretty wild if you ask me." Red glanced over the spillway to the south side of the riverbed, nearly 80 feet below. Far off in the distance, the highway bridge spanned the valley. "Will she hold?" Red asked as they neared the blockhouse. "Well, this old gal has been well maintained through the years," Kirkpatrick boasted as he opened the heavy metal door. Red reached into his pocket for a pistol as the heavy-set man set down a magazine. Lily wanted to cry out, but her gift proved to be a curse as she was unable to stop the distant murder from happening. Look who's come to lend a hand," Kirkpatrick introduced Red as the man at the desk stretched out a hand, only to be shot squarely in the chest. The hot tip of the pistol singed hair as Red held it to Kirkpatrick's head. "We need to talk about these gates." After that, Red was able to work without interruption. He no longer heard the whimpers and pleas from Kirkpatrick, nor did he hear the roar of water through the gates and spillways. He climbed up the steps from the inner workings of the concrete dam where he'd left Kirkpatrick's body. Trailing behind him, the detonation wire climbed up the stairs and through the control room where the other dam worker's body lay. "Why am I allowed to see this?" Lily wondered, "if I am powerless to stop it from happening?" The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. as he kicked open the door, trailing wire behind. He managed to cross the log chute bridge and go back down to the car with plenty left on the spool. He rigged it to the detonator and exhaled, watching as the water rose. Everything was set. Careful not to disturb the wire, Red jogged back over the deck. When he reached the water level control room, the water was already breaching the shoulder of the dam. He pushed the alarm, filling the valley with its grating pulse. By the time he reached the cars, the roar of the water began again, more violently than it had before. Red depressed the plunger, and the force of the explosion shook the ground as the wall of water crumbled the dam. Half of the parking lot fell into the roaring void, taking the cars with it. Red stood for a moment to admire his work before jogging north. Lily, still asleep in her nursing home bed, could only watch from a distance. Instead of following the retreating servant, she followed the wall of water as it rumbled through the Blue Knife River cavern. When it reached Lake Manitou, the wall dropped into the depths of the lake for just a few seconds before an even larger wave rose. "You broke the agreement," a voice in the dark abyss said. The real Wintermaker had seen her. "A life for a life," the Wintermaker said. "You swore an oath." "You are the one who broke the pact," Lily snapped. "You broke it the day Jean died." "I fulfilled my part, and I gave him back to you. Now, I learn you lied to me. You withheld what was promised." "How could I? The time has not yet come." "Do you think you could trick me? Do you think my servants would not keep watch over me? I know what you will do, so I have sent them to make sure you will deliver your end of the bargain. You threaten to tear apart the web? Then I counter. I will tear apart your world. Look what waits for you." Beyond the depths of Lake Manitou, Lily scanned the darkness. Far to the south, she saw Cameron alone, surrounded by the Tokpai. He ran, terrified, until they trapped him at the shore, forcing him into the scaffolding of the broken roller coaster. Farther up the shore, Lily saw floodwaters engulfing the house Jean had built. Lewis and Hannah fought the flood as the house shifted on its foundations. At Bleeding Rock, Lily heard a familiar song. The man in the tweed jacket and derby hat stood near a small fire, where a young woman with vibrant red hair sang a song that had been protected by the Ouija for generations. "Am Impossible. Lily's spirit came snapping back into her body. The pain of her age and physical ailments throbbed, and her consciousness swirled to take control of her senses. She felt a hand on her shoulder and heard a voice. "Grandma Lily, wake up," the girl said. "Nokomis." Lily turned to see Nicole and Gavin standing at her bedside. "Nokomis, we need your help." Lily looked over to the clock. "It's not time yet. There is still a chance to stop it." Chapter 58, Cast Thy Nets. Haggard Quarry, March 20th, 1962. Wally Crane remembered the terror of the Japanese patrol boat that illuminated the USS South Dakota in a shower of light. The Japanese fleet had returned to Guadalcanal like a swarm of hornets defending their nests, and after a few immediate hits on enemy ships, the task force quickly became surrounded, including the USS South Dakota. The shower of light had allowed 3 Japanese ships to locate and open fire on the South Dakota, whose engine room had lost power. 26 shells hit the battleship in the engagement and would have undoubtedly sunk it if they had not kept firing back. When the shelling finally stopped, the ship stood alone at the battle as the battle drifted away from them. 26 years later, Wally still dreaded the thought of drowning in the dark. The distant siren brought him to the present. Caught by his headlights, he saw the shore absorb the initial blow. A wave of water several feet high that came from the north bounced against the western shore and continued south. Standing above the shore on the road, he heard the distant roar of the Blue Knife River amplified by the crashing waves not driven by any wind. Wally ran to his boat, unstrapped the rear and security chain, took hold of the guide rope, and returned to the truck cab. He headed toward St. John, hammering his horn with the flat of his fist as he neared the cabins along the northwestern shore. All around the lake, lights were turning on, but the water was rising faster than folks could evacuate their homes. By the time he reached St. John, the Blue Knife River had discharged enough water to swallow a side road. He turned the rig around and drove into the water until it reached the base of his door. The boat lifted from the trailer, and with a tug, he brought it up to beside the cab of his truck, allowing him to hop in. His awkward flop nearly flipped the fishing boat, but soon he had the motor running and was zipping across the lake. Halfway across the body of water, his fears were confirmed. The Nicollet Dam had burst. Even over his motor, he could hear the sustained flow of water rushing into the lake. In his mind, he tried to make sense of the disaster. What has Red done? By the time he returned to the shore, he heard cries of help coming from the lakeside neighborhood. Water had climbed halfway up the sides of the houses. At the closest house, he saw a man standing on top of his porch railing with his hands on the edge of the roof, where a woman and 2 boys were sitting. As Wally pulled up beside him, the waves on Lake Manitou tossed his boat. "Set the children in first," Wally said, doing his best to balance the boat. Once the children were in, he had them move to the other side so that the woman could enter without tipping it. Finally, the husband joined them, and Wally turned the boat toward St. John. Instead of finding a park, Wally saw the road leading to it and chose it as a boat landing. There were dozens of people heading toward the water, and more sirens filled the air. His boat slid to a stop on the pavement of the flooded road, and strangers helped unload his cargo. "Find me some sort of light," Wally shouted as his terrified passengers climbed out. The same strangers on the shore gave him a shove so he could return to help others. Even though night blanketed everything, the western shore came alive as the St. John community woke to the disaster that had befallen it. Soon, the lights of vehicles flooded the shoreline, allowing Wally to easily pinpoint those in greatest need. He pulled up to the closest house, this time seeing folks in a small second-floor window. The water had risen 10 feet, preventing a land rescue. He slammed into the side of the house and tried to cling to the siding so that the elderly man and his wife could lower their feet from the window. "We heard a siren," the man said while holding his wife's hand as she descended to Wally. But we didn't know what it meant. A minute later, waves slammed into our front door. The siren you heard was from the Nicollet Dam, Wally explained as he guided the women to the rear of the boat. The high water must have busted it wide open. The old man turned and lowered his feet out of the window. He didn't have time to inflict his wrath on Red Dobie. It was too late. "Help, over here!" Wally heard splashing and could see another elderly fellow pulling his wife on a tractor tire toward Wally. "Stay here, I'll come to you." He engaged his motor and pushed 20 yards to the next cabin. He could hear men on the highway behind the house trying to reach the homes, but a fence, hedges, and several trees created a barrier. With the help of his two passengers, Wally balanced his boat as he pulled up to the wife and rolled her over the side of the boat. With the two elderly ladies balancing the craft, he and his elderly guest both reached out their arms and pulled the other man up and into the boat. "Where did all this water come from?" the baffled male asked. "The Nicollet Dam burst," Wally answered, turning the boat around. "Goddamn negligence! They should have torn that out years ago," the man bitterly complained. "Let's get you folks to safety before we plan any lawsuits," Wally muttered as he throttled the engines as fast as he dared. As he neared St. John, he looked down the length of the 7-mile lake and wondered what sort of devastation had been caused elsewhere. The place he dropped off the first load had risen another foot, but dozens of people waited to help. Once again, he slid onto the road, and several good Samaritans rushed up to him. 2 lit lanterns and an industrial flashlight were handed to Wally this time, and 4 life jackets were thrown into the boat. He heard another boat out on the lake, which must have been put in to storage for the winter. Must not have been put in for storage for the winter. If it hadn't been for the bus accident, his boat would not have been ready either. Up and down the shore, he could see household items and other oddities floating in the lake that had suddenly burst its bank, so he kept his engine controlled as he returned to the flooded homes. This time, as he neared the stretch of 20 cabins, he heard screams and shouts, but not from the confused residents. Instead, the hollering came from the road. "Get out of there! Get out of there!" someone shouted, but Wally still could not see the problem. He heard others shouting too, but a strange roar kept him from understanding what they said. With the flashlight, he turned the beam from house to house until he spotted a woman sitting upon a block boathouse and her husband standing on something knee-deep in water. Wally glided up beside the man who flung himself in the boat, rocking it precariously. "Get out of there!" somebody shouted. As Wally nosed the boat toward the boathouse, he noticed something very strange. Current passing around the corner. "The quarry breached! Get out of there!" a voice shouted. Wally had to throttle his boat fully, and the husband was almost pulled into the water as he grabbed onto the light pole along the side of the boathouse, while the nose of the boat ricocheted away. For the love of his wife, he held tight, pulling the boat back to the building. He slid off the flat roof quickly, and as soon as she did, Wally throttled the boat again, lifting the nose of the boat. Several houses began to move away from their foundations and follow the current toward the quarry. Wally headed directly for the road again, and when he arrived, he saw a crowd that had almost doubled in size. The water had dropped 2 feet since his last trip, a perplexing sign. "Rope! Somebody get me a rope!" Wally had to wait at most a few moments before someone came running, tossing him a coil of 30 feet of barn rope. "The quarry's breached," someone shouted, but Wally turned around for another go. "Death magic," Ewan had said. The more souls he saved, the weaker the death magic would be for the servants of the Wintermaker. With several cars on both sides of the severed highway, Wally could see the glorious power of nature. Illuminated by headlights of the 24 cars pointed at it, a cloud of mist arose out of the quarry. The entire Blue Knife watershed shifted course as 40,000 cubits of water flowed through a cut along the western edge. What began as a slight trickle over the road and into the quarry quickly undercut the road, and as the river rose, the slight flow of water ripped out the pavement and road foundation, soon forming a brand new split rock as the water ate through the false bank created decades earlier. A heavy-set woman in a white nightgown came waddling through the doorway of her house, knee-deep in water. "Stay where you are," Wally shouted to her and tossed one of the life jackets, which she hastily put on. "I need a rope to help me anchor or I'll drift away." Despite the pull of the water, Wally eased up to her house, and with the rope gripped in his left hand, he threw it to her. Even in those few seconds, his boat drifted sideways toward the breach. "Tie it to your colonnade," Wally instructed, seeing exposed posts supporting the awning over the woman's head. "I don't know how to tie a knot." Wally swore to himself before he called back. "Pass the coil around the post and let it go." The heavy-set woman did as instructed, and once the coil of rope passed through the colonnade, the current pulled it away from the house. As Wally approached, he pointed his bow right at the small porch, and with a thrust of his arm, caught the other end of the rope, creating a full loop instead of a knot. He pulled his boat back to the little porch and tied the two ends of the rope around the passenger boat seat. Only then did he feel safe enough to gather up the woman. "Okay, ma'am," Wally said. "Walk on over to me." When she fell off the step, she panicked and began to cry. "It's okay, ma'am. Just a few more steps and I'll be able to grab your hand. Do you see all that debris floating by? It's being pushed into the quarry. Your house might go with it any second." The woman continued to cry, but soon waded in water up to her belly. Then suddenly she was gone. The current pulled her feet out from under her, but fortunately toward him, allowing Wally to catch her by the life jacket. He heaved her up to the side of the boat. I need you to get out of the water. I need to get you out of the water, but I'm going to have to pull you by the back of the boat." But the motor, it's in neutral, so it won't hurt you. If I haul you up over the side, the boat might capsize. You ready?" He nodded. She nodded, and Wally helped guide her to the spot beside the motor. He put the heels of his boots against the back of the boat's splash guard, and then stretched out over the motor with his two hands. "I'm going to need you to put your feet against the motor to help me. On the count of 3, do all you can to extend your legs like you were standing up from a squatting position. I'm going to haul you up and over the motor, understand?" She whimpered but understood. "Okay, ma'am. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Wally held onto her wrists and lifted her dead weight up and over the motor, and as her torso cleared the motor, he let gravity pull him backwards into the boat, with her collapsing on top of him. He rolled her off him and quickly got up to his captain's chair. Luckily, the house stood still for a few moments longer, but his hands were so cold he could not untie his own knots, so he reached into his jacket and pulled out his father's Barlow jackknife. With a few firm cuts, he broke free of the house, quickly hoisting up the loose rope before gunning the engine. Now, close to the quarry, he saw an opening in the trees and gunned the engine again with all its might. He went shooting right up onto the highway to the applause of 24 folks that stood on it. This time, Wally leaned back and collapsed in his chair. Bystanders helped the woman from the boat, and Wally closed his eyes as the roar of the created haggard waterfall continued. Then he heard someone calling out his name. "Wally, are you okay?" It was Gavin McPherson. Wally nodded, and then noticed that Nicky Guerin stood beside Gavin. And beside Gavin's car, Lily Guerin stood. Thank God. Lily will know what to do next. Chapter 59. Sacrifice of the Fisher Cat. Mesquite Band of Ojibwe Reservation, March 20th, 1962. Nicky Guerin gripped the edge of her seat. "We're going to get stuck," she muttered as Gavin turned off the main road, which was terrible, and onto a side road, which was worse. Along the side of the road, old drifts of snow still remained, accounting for the puddles that all but filled the side road. As Gavin's car moved, Nicky could see waves of water and a deep rut of mud being formed by the front tire. Yet somehow, they didn't get stuck. In the back seat, Grandma Lily sat motionless, her jaw fixed, and her eyes focused on a distant place in time. Could Fawn be right? Is Grandma Lily a villain? Even before they finished telling Chris Looning's story, Lily was prepared to leave. The more they tried to explain the situation, the angrier her grandmother had become. Meddling, arrogance, all of this fear and death was caused by a small ripple the day that man showed up in his shiny red car looking for me. What man? Gavin asked. The stranger from last summer, Nikki clarified, receiving a slight nod from her grandmother. What did he do? He was the pebble that disturbed the still waters, an unexpected enemy. Now we will see the waves he has made. She grew silent after that, and the car ride from Leech Lake seemed to take forever after Grandma Lily had instructed Gavin, "Take me to my brother." McGeesey was outside his shack, wearing a black hat, a snapping turtle shell on his left arm, and a hatchet in his right hand. Considering all their driving, Nicky knew it had to be at least midnight, yet there the old man stood, waiting as Gavin's headlights illuminated the end of the road. "My brother looks ready for a fight," Lily said with disdain. "But who's he prepared to fight?" "Stay in the car." Nicky shot a glance at Gavin as her grandmother opened the rear door, and the cab light came on, blinding them. "Should we go with?" Gavin asked, motioning toward the door Lily had left open. "I have no idea," Nicky admitted. "Let's give them a few minutes. They haven't talked in years. Shut the door so we can see." The two elderly siblings stood toe-to-toe as a small fire burned behind them. Gavin's headlights illuminated the sweat lodge near the Blue Knife River. Suddenly, without any explanation, Grandma Lily walked off toward the river by herself. "What is she doing?" Gavin asked. "Who knows? Should we follow her?" Somehow I have a feeling the answer is no. McGeesey turned in the direction of the car, took a step toward them, but then turned around and returned to the deck, where he pulled a heavy blanket over his lap. And that is how it remained for quite a while, with the only change coming when Nicky reached out her hand to take hold of Gavin's. "I shouldn't have made Cameron lie for me," Nicky finally said, thinking of her brother alone at the park. "Do you want to leave?" "I don't know. This is so surreal." "Hey, it's okay. I'll take the heat for this if we get in trouble. I have made it pretty easy on my folks so far, and if we need to, we can show them Lily, right?" "I don't know if it's better if they think we're fooling around or being completely crazy." "I guess we're about to find out." Nicky laughed through her fear. "We should go talk to McGeesey, to find out what Grandma's doing. She's been gone a long time." Gavin turned off the engine and lights, leaving only the red glow of the small fire to illuminate the area. Nicky wrapped her arm around Gavin's and walked with him to the little shack. "Are the lambs curious why the farmer is sharpening his axe?" McGeesey asked so morbidly that Nicky stopped walking, only to be tugged forward by Gavin. "Where did Lily go?" Gavin asked. "More likely than not to make matters worse than they are. Come, stand with me for a while." Gavin led her up onto the deck. "So what's happening?" McGeesey looked at him carefully and then at her. "Love will not be strong enough to defeat the evil that slumbers. Tell me, lovebirds, would you be willing to die so that the other might live?" "Fawn wrote to try to save Michelle, but my older sisters are all safe, far away from home. Am I in danger?" Nicky felt the terrible silence that followed the question, but even before she could think about an answer, Gavin answered, "Yes." "Humph," McGeesey muttered. "Because of my sister, I avoided love. I never married. I never sired any little lambs because I did not want to see my love be used against my duty. Lily once had to make a choice between duty and love. Do you know what she chose?" 50 years after his death, Grandpa Gene still haunted Grandma Lily. Nicky knew the pain without knowing all the details. What am I thinking? Grandma Lily is a hero. She chose love. She did. Lily also had to make a choice between love and family. Did she tell you that story? Nikki shook her head. If you had to pick between Gavin and your unborn children and your unborn grandchildren and unborn great-grandchildren that came to you across the river at the time, or your brother Cameron, who would you pick? How do I make a choice like that? Nikki hesitated, and Gavin looked away from her. She tightened her grip on his arm. Lily did not choose her little brother, McGeesy said, and to hurt her, I withheld having a family, lest I add more lambs to the slaughtering pen. He shook his head. Where did Lily go? That is what you want to know? I've been contending with the Takpai and the Jibe each night while she hid up at Leech Lake, and now, with her ego bruised, she is about to go to war again. It is not a coincidence that she has already armed herself with a prized lamb and an heir. Me? Nikki asked. What do you mean? The letter felt even heavier in her pocket. McGeesy shook his turtle shell strapped to his arm. I've learned much since I was a boy, but your grandmother was chosen by Manabozho to be a Wabano, a powerful sorceress. She is going to collect her weapons for battle. She is gathering her shield right now, but you are her sword. If she thinks she is losing the battle, she'll use you as a weapon. Nikki had grown up with sweet Grandma Lily and only knew McGeesy from a sprinkling of brief encounters. She didn't want to believe him. A weapon? What do you mean? He pointed to the stars. Do you see the Fisher Cat? Nikki looked for the Big Dipper. Long ago, the Fisher Cat battled the Wintermaker and prevailed because it was willing to sacrifice everything that it loved. Love is selfish. To win, you will need to sacrifice. My sister was not strong enough, and her false victory came at a great cost. What has she told you about it, little lamb? A lot of people died. McGeesy cackled. Prophecy is like a flowing river. If you were to place a small log into the headwaters and then run down to the delta of the river, the log would eventually float down all the way, fulfilling its destiny. If you try to stop the log from reaching the delta, the flowing waters will build and build and build behind your obstruction until they burst forth, bringing chaos and destruction down the river valley. Yet the log will still arrive. My sister built a dam to save me. You seem ungrateful about it, or guilty. She thought she could have both true love and family. Now I am a worthless old man withering away, waiting for death to arrive. I learned long ago that I cannot stop the flow of a river, a lesson your grandmother has yet to learn. If you listen closely, you can hear her song upon the wind. Nikki heard it, and it echoed in her bones. She grabbed Gavin tighter. Even though she could hear her grandmother's voice, she heard layers of other voices joining to act as a chorus. Normal sound bounced off objects to create echoes. The song seemed to pass through objects, causing them to resonate like a tuning fork. What is that? Magic from the dawn. I think she'd best explain that to you herself, McGeesy said. If she refused to teach me the secrets of the Ouija, then I should not presume she'd teach them to her granddaughter. The damp and darkness made Nikki begin to shake, and she found herself holding on to the cross pendant her mother had given her. Even with Gavin's arm now around her, she couldn't stop shivering. Gavin finally said, "Let's go wait in the car." McGeesy cast a look of disdain and shrugged. Back in the car, Nikki couldn't stop shaking, and in her mind, she correlated the song with the coldness she felt. Gavin turned up the heater, but the warm air did little. I'm scared, Gavin. I feel as if... An alarm began to blare in the distance, and Gavin rolled down his window. Nikki did the same, pinpointing the sound to the south. What has Grandma Lily done? An explosion ripped the air as energy passed through it. What in the world was that? Gavin asked, stepping back out into the night. Nikki, choosing the shelter of the car, did not join him. She didn't want to know. Gavin rushed to the edge of the reservoir while McGeesy picked up his hatchet and shield, arming himself on the deck. In the distance, carrying an object in her cupped hands, Grandma Lily appeared. McGeesy headed toward her. Gavin kept peering downstream, and when he saw the two siblings, he ran up to them, pointing back to the river. Finally, the trio broke up, with McGeesy stomping toward the sound of the explosion, and Gavin and Grandma Lily walking back toward the car. Gavin stayed at her side and helped her slide into the back seat. Nikki smelled something burning and saw that the cloth-wrapped object in Lily's hands had wisps of smoke coming from it. "I think the dam collapsed," Gavin said once he jumped back into the driver's seat. "I could see water dropping all along the shore." "And it's all heading towards Lake Manitou," Nikki whispered. "Oh no, what about Mom and Dad? What about Cameron? He's all alone at the park." "If the Wintermaker has broken his oath, then we'll go after your brother," Grandma Lily said, her voice hoarse. "I have put him in grave danger." "How?" Nikki said, McGeesy's distrust seeping in. "What did you do, Grandma?" "While I have been away, the Tokpai have grown strong, emboldened, no doubt, by the men of the dawn. I have taught your brother verses from the Song of the Manitou, and now the Tokpai will force him to reveal the magic he has learned. We must stop them." "That's a plan," Gavin admitted, "but we can't get to Cameron from the east, so we'll need to drive around Lake Manitou to the west if we still can." As Gavin backed up, his lights reached the edge of the woods, where McGeesy crept into the trees. "What's he doing?" Nikki asked. "Hunting herons," Lily scoffed. "He thinks I am wrong about the battle tonight. He doesn't understand the danger. I can sense an intrusion, and as if I were to guess, someone is trying to break the loop." "Is the Wintermaker really real? Or just some evil force like the Tokpai?" "Right now, he sleeps. When I was your age, he almost took human form again, but I forced him back into the depths. As long as I have life in me, I will not let him rise again." The car reached the highway and turned south. The object her grandmother cradled in her lap appeared to have a good deal of weight, and although wrapped in musty old fabric, looked to be about the size of a football. "What is it that you have with you?" Nikki asked, but her grandmother tisks. "I have nothing. You see nothing. Is that clear?" "But is that clear? The Tokpai will kill your brother to find out what I hold in my hands. Men have killed to find this. Put this out of your mind, Nicole." "Okay," she said and turned around. Nevertheless, the object began to fester in her thoughts. She remembered a tale found in Father Garen's journal about a Sioux warrior named Wishwe who had battled a terrible shape-shifting monster known as No Soul. To defeat the monster, the warrior had used a magical egg. Is that the same object? Nikki felt a cold evil emanating from it. Gavin was turning west toward St. John as they reached the ridge of the river valley. He stepped hard on his brakes. "Holy cow! Would you look at that?" Nikki had already seen it. For a moment, she thought she saw a tidal wave of water reaching over the highway. But it was only mist from the violent release of water upstream. "What should I do?" "We can drive around to the north. We could take the Sabika Road and then back down south." "No," Grandma Lily insisted. "Just drive through it." I can't even see if the bridge is there." "It will be," her grandmother said. "It must be. We will close the loop tonight and tie it tightly." Gavin kept driving. His headlights pierced the rain cloud that rose out of the river valley. He turned his windshield wipers on high and entered the thick mist. Through the accumulating moisture on her passenger window, Nicky could see the turbid water roiling through the valley toward the lake. "It's gone! The dam is totally gone!" Their passage through the water ended when another pair of headlights met them on the other side of the bridge. A man stood beside his car, his driver's door open. Gavin rolled down his window. "What in the world is happening?" the man asked. "I think the dam burst," Gavin answered. "I heard sirens right before an explosion." Just then, red lights and sirens came over the top of the Western Valley as emergency vehicles from St. John rushed to investigate. Gavin drove on, passing them on their descent. A few minutes later, the trio arrived at St. John, where dozens of vehicles and people rushed to the lake, creating a traffic jam. Fortunately, there was no order in the chaos, allowing Gavin to pass through town and then sneak out onto Quarry Road. Just like at the Blue Knife River, another storm cloud seemed to be sitting in the middle of the road ahead of them. 3 or 4 cars made a roadblock of sorts, and Gavin pulled up behind them. "Holy crud, would you look at that!" The pavement, erosion rock, and shore had all been washed away as water that flowed over the road tore a channel from the flooded lake and into the quarry, creating a roaring waterfall that emptied into the belly of a giant hole in the ground. 6 people stood gawking. "How will we reach Cameron now?" Nicky asked. I should have stayed with him. "We could turn around and drive west toward Wadena, cut down and around." "We wait," Grandma Lily said. "The spirits of the dead will come to our aid. They know I am their ally." Gavin gripped the steering wheel before releasing a breath. "Okay, we'll wait." He stepped out of the car, and Nicky joined him. Together, they walked closer to the chasm, now almost 20 feet across. Even since they had arrived, the water level in the quarry had risen dramatically. On occasion, debris from the lake approached and, in a span of 2 seconds, was sucked into the chasm and over the edge of the quarry. Distant shouts drew Nicky's attention away from the spectacle and toward the shoreline. A dozen men waded through the waters near a submerged housing development. Past it, Nicky saw a boat in the water cutting through a break and come shooting towards where they stood, skidding to a stop on the pavement. The bystanders, including herself, applauded. Gavin and others rushed over to help the stunned woman step out of the nose of the boat. The man driving leaned back in obvious shock and exhaustion. "Wally, are you okay?" Gavin asked, and only then did Nicky recognize who drove the boat. It was Wally Crane. Wally opened his eyes and looked around for a bit, dazed. He looked at Gavin and at her. Then his gaze drifted behind her. Nicky turned to see Grandma Lily out of the car, walking toward them. In her hands, she saw the heavy object with the scorched fabric draped over it. "They have my grandson," she said to Wally. "Climb in. I'll get you there," Wally answered. Nicky and Gavin helped Grandma Lily climb into the boat. She sat down beside Wally in the passenger swivel chair. You were part of this too," Wally said to them. "Push us off and climb in." Nicky climbed in first, and with a shove, Gavin pushed them back into the water. Terror gripped Nicky for a moment as the current pulled them toward the chasm, but Wally's boat engine growled, propelling them through the gap and into the lake. Without even being told, Wally aimed the nose of the boat toward the southeastern corner of Lake Manitou. "We're coming, Cameron." Chapter 60. The Cloud Champion. Old Copper Road, March 20th, 1962. Ed Nielsen rose from his bed wearing his insulated long johns and walked through the formal dining room, turning to the steep stairs that led to the children's room. As he ascended the stairs, he had to remind himself that Rachel and Faye had grown up and moved away. He also had to remind himself that Jimmy was still at the hospital in Brainerd, recovering from hypothermia and soaking up all the attention given to him by the nurses. He stood at Alexandra's doorway for a minute, gently took hold of the handle, and slowly turned it. Through the crack, he could see her sleeping soundly and safely in her bed. Relieved, Ed closed the door and walked to the end of the narrow hallway. His fingers held onto the knob for several seconds before he twisted it and threw the door wide open. The figure on the bed turned to face him. "I think I'm dead," the figure said, and then blood poured out of the corner of his mouth and onto his chest. Ed stood frozen. The figure sitting on Jimmy's bed looked to be about 16. Unlike Jimmy's blonde mop, the intruder's sandy hair was shaved down to the scalp. The boy reached up and wiggled his jaw, which his fingers moved as if the bones had turned to jello. "I'm looking for my father," the figure said, seeing Ed still standing in the doorway. "Have you seen him?" Ed pushed his fear down and found his voice. "I think you must be lost. This isn't your house. Why are you here?" The figure stopped playing with his broken jaw. "I was with my sister and grandmother," he answered, and then looked around. "This isn't her mobile home. I think it's time for you to go home now." "Time? Yeah," the young man said and stood. "I think this is the wrong time. I need to go find my dad." Instead of heading toward Ed at the doorway, the figure stepped right through the wall and vanished. Ed had to steady himself in the doorway for a moment before he moved to the window. Peering out, he saw no sign of the figure, nor did the boy leave a blood stain on Jimmy's bed when he turned back around. In the distance, the faint sound of a siren began from St. John. Ed quickly descended the narrow stairs. He passed into the kitchen and onto the front porch, which faced the lake. He stood in the doorway when a boom tore the night air. For a few moments, his heartbeat was the loudest sound. Then, a grinding rumble grew. Sweet Jesus, is that what I think it is? Ed didn't go back for his jeans and flannel shirt. Instead, he slipped right into a pair of overalls and snow boots he'd left by the door. The phone rang, and Bonnie appeared, answering it. As she listened, he knew. The Nicollet Dam had given way. He put his blue and white DeKalb Seeds hat onto his head and stepped back outside. Sirens from both St. John and Split Rock began as he rushed to his truck. 100 yards from Ed's driveway, the paved Wadena Road met Old Copper Road, which he followed into the thick oak grove. For almost a mile, the old road descended from the bluff until he had to slam on his brakes. Water crossed over the gravel road. He pulled right up to the edge of the water, seeing the Larson mailbox on the right side of the road and distant sign marking the entrance to Carousel Park. To reach Split Rock, he'd have to either go through the water or go all the way around. Before he could make up his mind, he heard shouting. Ed stepped out of his truck and heard sloshing in the water coming from the Larson farm. Neil Larson, walking in chest-deep water, pulled his wife and 2 daughters in an 8-foot orange sailboat without a sail. Thank God you found us," Mrs. Larson called out as Neil labored at the corner of the driveway and Old Copper Road. In the distance, a cow swam toward them until it found footing on the flooded road. "I got him," Ed said, wading out and taking the rope so that Neil could focus on walking up the hill to the waiting truck. As both men pushed through the water covering the road, one of the girls found her voice. "I hear somebody calling for help." Ed stopped. Sure enough, a male voice called out from the distant direction of Carousel Park. "All of you climb into my truck and get warm." The shock of the current events left him breathing so heavily that he had to swallow and close his mouth for silence. Then he heard it, a man's voice, through the water and trees. Ed called to Neil, "If you don't mind me borrowing your dinghy, I'm going to go see who's out there." Ed went to the back of his truck and grabbed a shovel and returned to the dinghy just as another bewildered cow stepped onto the road. Bending down, he loosened the bolt that held the mast of the boat in place, and once loose, he tossed it into the water-filled ditch. With his shovel in hand, Ed used it to push off the gravel and into the water, and with the flat edge of the shovel, paddled over the flooded road. 3 pigs, water up to their snouts, kicked with all their might as he passed. The current pulled Ed toward the Guerin farm, the source of the livestock. In the distance, he saw trucks on the road and commotion. Even from a quarter-mile away, he recognized the trucks of the McPherson brothers. And at the edge of the water, he saw the figures of Mr. and Mrs. Guerin climbing out of a duck boat. Their entire farm had flooded. "Cameron!" Mrs. Guerin shouted to the darkness. "Cameron!" The McPhersons joined the chorus of calls, all directed toward Ed and the park. The culvert had plugged, preventing the McPhersons from continuing. "Help!" a voice called out through the trees. Ed put his shovel into the water and turned the dinghy toward the current and back toward Carousel Park. It took sustained, violent paddling to gain ground, and once he had to stop to hold onto a tree just to catch his breath. Above him, a raven took wing, flying toward the commotion coming from deeper in the park, near the lake. The large wooden billboard welcoming guests to Carousel Park was half covered by the floodwaters as he passed. The cries for help fell silent, and for a while, all Ed could hear was the sound of his shovel slicing through the water. The entire park was submerged, water crawling halfway up most buildings. Ed felt as if he was walking through an open graveyard. "Hello?" he called out, seeing a parked car in the lot. "Is somebody there?" An explosion of chaos answered him, but it came from afar. This is what Lily warned me about. A blend of a woman's screaming, a man's defiant yells, panic cries for help, and a strange melodic chant came together with sounds of a big motor, a boat motor, and strange whooshing noises. Oh God, I know those voices. Ed pushed on, paddling past the main part of the park until he finally had a view of the lake and Carousel Island. The images he saw baffled him more than the boy with the broken jaw. A young man dangled from the roller coaster tracks that passed over the water. His apparent goal was a man in a tree, its branches swaying wildly from side to side. A few yards away, a young woman wrapped her arms around another tree as she sat in its lowest crook. Beyond that, at the dance hall, a very soaked Wally Crane stood beside Lily Guerin, still dry. In her hands, she held a lantern that illuminated where they both stood upon the stage, just inches away from being swallowed by the water. Between the roller coaster and the stage, an overturned boat spun in the current of the water, still tied to a tree. "Hey, you folks look like you need help," Ed shouted in their direction. All heads, as well as 24 eyes, turned toward him. Oh, what the hell? The young man who dangled from the roller coaster tracks quickly pulled his legs back up to the tracks as the whole structure lurched. It lurched because two gray creatures let go and came rushing at Ed. Son of a bitch! The lantern that Lily held burst into flames that almost consumed Wally, who took a few steps away from her. Yet Lily stood in its fire, unharmed as fingers of flames reached into the air in front of her. "I warned you what would happen," Lily shouted, the flames swirling over her head like a fiery tornado. Now the rest of the red eyes were fixed on her. The gray creatures moved in unison, gathering together for a moment before plunging into the water, only to rise as a column of water that equaled the thickness and length of the roller coaster track. Like a cobra, it raised and postured, but Lily's flames snapped at it, casting it back to the lake. "You should not have broken the oath," Lily shouted. "Now your master will pay the price." The gray creatures lashed out individually, and flame and water crashed, with some of the creatures being violently thrown through the roof of the hall, tearing it to pieces. Ed saw two gray creatures running over the surface as if the lake was still frozen over. They were charging at him. Shit. It wasn't until the closest one was almost on him that he pulled the shovel from the water and swung. Even though it was not a solid blow, his swing sent the creature flying past him. Just as the second creature reached the boat, Ed cocked the shovel back again, prompting the gray beast to dive low, striking the nose of the boat. The strong force flung him forward. To keep from flying off, Ed let go of the shovel for a second to cling to a rear cleat. When he managed to stay on the boat, the shovel slid past his feet and into the water. The gray creature climbed up onto the nose of the boat. Its long fingers grabbed a hold of his legs, ripping the unlaced boots from his feet. Once, when Ed had been doing chores, he'd come around the corner to face a buck possum who hissed and snarled and charged right at him. Halfway through that terrifying moment, Ed had raised his voice and yelled, "Get!" It sent the possum scurrying away. Now, the horror of facing the oily creatures stole his voice. The tutelage of Grandpa Martin and Lily Guerin evaporated as a monster latched onto his leg at the calf. The second talk pie snuck up from behind, wrapping its long fingers around his hand, prying his finger to loose from the cleat. Together, they tried to pull him into the frigid waters of Lake Manitou. This is the end of Part 13.